Okay, the red light is on, indicating it's time to go. All right, so I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'll acknowledge the Darkinjung people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that the Central Coast campus is situated on, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today, and of course to any of you who are, working towards having a socially just Australia. Okay, so one of the things that you will find as you go through university events and certainly in public life is people performing either a welcome to country or an acknowledgement of country. All right. What we find in the Wallatuka Institute is that quite often our students, for instance, if they give a presentation, will perform an acknowledgement beforehand. Part of the reason why we do that is that it draws on, century and in fact thousands of years of tradition, where even for Aboriginal people moving into someone else's country, you acknowledged your presence and you asked permission to be on somebody else's country. And you also, in doing that, indicated your respect, both for them, for their traditions, and for their elders. So we see this as something that is important and quite meaningful. Sometimes I get students, who'll say, should I perform an acknowledgement of country? And, if so, how should I do that? And I think one of the things for us is that because it does have meaning, if it's something that you're simply doing because you think it's a protocol, then we'd actually prefer that you don't, okay? But if you do feel that this is something, that you would like to do, then I've given you a couple of hyperlinks. So the university has its own policy, but then probably one of the best used external links is the guide for public schools and TAFEs in New South Wales. So one of the things that we do find is that with an acknowledgement of country in public life, it's often at an event the only time that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, will have a voice. So when we see things in the media where, we'll see certain councils saying, well, they are taking away their acknowledgement of country, it's quite ironic because at the same time in their strategic plan, they'll often say, we'd like to have more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in council and in council activities, and they don't see that there's, a little bit of irony that while on the one hand wanting Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people to engage, they take away, that structural element that indicates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander involvement. Okay. Oh, that's not moving on. Right. Okay. All right. So, not quite sure why the bottom of that is disappearing. All right. So there are hundreds of variations in the way that being Aboriginal was and is expressed as a lived experience within Australia. And that includes people's spirituality, languages, affiliation to country, art styles, music, law, and also the level of interaction and synthesis with introduced cultures. And one of the things that we say very clearly is that no one culture is better or has a greater authenticity. And this stands in contrast to what we see, for instance, in the media, because they sometimes use this term, real Aborigines. So in the media, real Aboriginal people are, people in Central Australia, people who speak and continue to speak their languages. But one of the things that we know in sociology is that language is incredibly powerful. So that if you're saying there's a group who are real Aboriginal people, the converse is there must be a group who are not real Aboriginal people. And in that media sense and in our sort of common sense discourse in the pub or, up at Westfield, the non-real Aboriginal people are constructed as being urban Aboriginal people who might be fairer skinned, who might have, not currently been able to practice their language. For us, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, those kind of distinctions are not meaningful because there's an acknowledgement that those forms of difference for urban Aboriginal people come as a consequence of a system that was imposed, not chosen. So to try and disadvantage or disinherit someone from the consequences of, because of the consequences of colonisation, would actually be another form of trauma that was being enacted on them. Okay, so we don't use those terms. All right. No, it's not moving on. Yes. Aha. There we go. I see. Every PDF screen in this university seems to be different. All right, so do we use the terms Indigenous or do we use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander? Well, actually, if we look at legislation that has been enacted since colonisation, there's been over 50 different definitions for what it means to be an Aboriginal person. And going with that, there's been a whole range of terminology. Okay, so Aboriginal being the term used for the majority of the 20th century. All right, so what we find is that there are differing community, students and staff preferences on the use of the term Indigenous. And so it's necessary to be responsive to those opinions, but also to be aware of the diversity of perspectives. And you need to be aware of what the preference is in your discipline or professional area. So, for instance, you may find a group like the nursing profession. So their staff organisation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Did that? Yeah, it's just turned off. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses, is CATSN. So that's the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses. On the other hand, you might find the Doctors Association, which is the Indigenous Doctors Association. So it's going to depend on the different professional group that you're interacting with as to what the preference for that term is. So I've done some research for the university on this with 3 of our main feeder communities. So here on the Central Coast, at Newcastle and at Port Macquarie. And what I found was that older Aboriginal people were more likely to continue to use the term Aboriginal, whereas people who had worked in, government jobs or younger people were more likely to use the term Indigenous. So there was that bit of variation. And I had an elder who gave this, oh, yuck. These batteries are corroded. And now my hands are covered in battery corrosion. It's going well. It's a good day. All right. Okay, so an elder who said that she thought of the term Indigenous as being like a ham and tomato sandwich. Here's the ham, here's the tomato, slap them together, and then call them one thing. She definitely preferred the term Aboriginal. And in fact, she said to me, I don't want you to use the term Indigenous at all. And I said, well, that's going to be a little bit difficult because the name of the project is Indigenisation of Curriculum. So I'm going to have to do that. So what you might find too, depending on the community that you work in, is that they may have their own particular term that they like. So it might be, a kind of generic term, like Koori or Goori, if you're sort of coastal New South Wales, or Murray, if you're Western New South Wales. Or it might be more specific again. So for instance, if you were on the north coast of New South Wales in Bundjalung country, it might be Baigal, which is the name for the people, yeah? So you're going to have to kind of play that one by ear. People say, how do I know which one I should use? The easiest way is to ask. But the other thing that you can find is that most Aboriginal organisations will have some kind of a web presence. So you can do a little bit of research, say if you're going into a community. Okay, good. And you can go in with a little bit of foreknowledge. Alrighty. Aha. Turn off. Sorry. Turn off. Won't turn off. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so for people listening to this online, oh, you have no idea, but but you have my apologies. Okay, we're cooking with gas. Right. Okay. So Peter Reid, who's the historian who first coined the term stolen generations, tells this story. So he says, in 1935, a fair-skinned Australian of part Indigenous descent was ejected from a hotel for being Aboriginal. He returned home on the mission station to find himself refused entry because he was not Aboriginal. He tried to remove his children, but was told he could not because they were Aboriginal. He walked to the next town where he was arrested for being an Aboriginal vagrant and placed on the local reserve. During World War II, he tried to enlist, but was told he could not because he was Aboriginal. He went interstate and joined up as a non-Aboriginal person. After the war, he could not acquire a passport without permission because he was Aboriginal. He received exemption from the Aborigines Protection Act and was told he could no longer visit his relations on the reserve because he was not an Aboriginal. He was denied permission to enter the Returned Servicemen's Club because he was. In the 1980s, his daughter went to university on an Aboriginal study grant, and on the first day, a fellow student demanded to know, what gives you the right to call yourself Aboriginal? Okay, so, this was written in 1998, and part of the reason why I use it is that it shows just how relatively quickly the type of language that we use changes. Because we wouldn't say today part Indigenous. That's very much something that comes from the 20th century. So if we look at the early Aboriginal protection legislation in the 1900s, so say Aborigines Protection Act 1909, what we see is that they made different categories of being an Aboriginal person based on whether there was a certain blood quantum. Okay, so blood quantum. So going from full blood to half caste to quarter caste to 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64, 1/28, and after that my mathematics skills give up. But the idea was, for the government, that probably by the time that you got past 1/16, that you would just simply meld into the broader Australian community. And we might sort of think, okay, well that was 1909, but this year in the news we saw Elizabeth Warren in the United States, who was planning to run for the presidency and who had claimed a Native American ancestry. And she went to one of those ancestry websites and got a DNA test done, and it showed that it was about 1 in 1,000. Okay? And, you know, if, as she was claiming, it was a historical, it was a historical descent, then it's, not that hard to see that a number of generations back that might be the case. And then people like Donald Trump, who then rejected her claim to Indigenous heritage because, 1/1000th was, not enough to make it meaningful. On the other hand, there were Native American groups who said that being a Native American person is not just about descent, it's also about identification, so that there were people with similar levels of ancestry to her, but who had maintained a connection to that heritage. And so even today, these things are playing themselves out. So in Australia, to be classified as an Aboriginal person, you need to meet 3 criteria. You need to be of Aboriginal descent, so that's biological, and then you need to meet 2 social criteria. So identifies as Aboriginal within their community and is accepted by their community as an Aboriginal person. All right, so what we find happens in many cases is that someone may find out, through looking through their family history, that an ancestor of theirs, often sort of at the level of great-grandparents or beyond, was an Aboriginal person. And so they might come to us at Wallatuka and say, I've discovered this Aboriginal heritage, but they don't meet the 3 criteria because they haven't identified within their community as an Aboriginal person or been accepted by their community as an Aboriginal person. On the other hand, we sometimes have students who come to Wallatuka whose family has always raised them to believe that they're an Aboriginal person. They've identified at school, they've gone through school in the Aboriginal students group, but when they come to the university, they need to provide a confirmation of Aboriginality. So they have criteria 2 and 3, but sometimes because Nan or Pop, or further back, may have been removed from their family and they're unable to find the records, they can't prove category 1. So it's not, people sort of say, oh, you can just claim to be Aboriginal. It's actually not as simple as that. So we've had students, who have gone back to that family's community of origin, and they've been able to find that proof of descent. We've had students who have found descent and then become engaged in the community and been able to meet criteria 2 and 3. So a confirmation of Aboriginality certificate has to come from an incorporated Aboriginal organisation. It has to have the common seal of that organisation affixed to it. There has to be a motion, a mover and a seconder, that they accept that person meets this definition. It has to be passed unanimously. So if any member of the organisation says, no, I don't think so, it's not passed. Under the New South Wales Aboriginal Lands Council system, you only have 3 goes to get your Aboriginality passed in a Lands Council, and if you're unable to do that by the 3rd time, you can't go again in your life. Okay, so when you've got that confirmation certificate, your name, your age, your date of birth, your address is forwarded to the Registrar of Aboriginal Corporations in Canberra. So it's an incredibly bureaucratic process that nobody else goes through, to prove their race or their ethnicity. Okay. Sometimes we hear examples of people who did get a confirmation, but in fact they weren't Aboriginal. And I think that any bureaucratic process has people who rot the system, whether that's, people who are applying for, welfare entitlements or, that kind of thing. All right. So as students and as academics, what are the things that we can bring to a sociological perspective on Aboriginal people? So you'll have already done the sociological imagination, which has those 4 arms: the historical, the critical, the structural, and the cultural. So that kind of provides us with our box. All right. Then we bring our own common sense understandings. Okay. Popular culture feeds in a lot to what we've got to put in that box. The media, academic texts, theory, oral histories, the creative arts, and community documentation. So they all go in there. Okay? But how do we do that slightly differently? So there's a term called Koriness, which was developed by Professor Bob Morgan, who is the chair of the board of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education and Research here at the university. And he said that Koriness is what Aboriginal people know about being an Aboriginal person. The connection with past generations, and the aspirations for the future. So we try and put those in at the bottom so that we can get an Indigenous sociology. All right. Okay, so let's think about what is colonisation. There's a whole range of ways of defining colonisation, but for the purpose of this lecture, we'll trace it being concerned with the global expansion of European powers from the 15th century. Okay, so that's England, France, Spain, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands. All right, and so they had all gotten together, and the other power that had come in on those discussions was the Church of Rome, which we probably today refer to more just as the Catholic Church. So they'd made an agreement on how countries could be acquired. Okay, so off they go. So they said that you could acquire territory via conquest, treaty, or legal declaration. And you could then declare sovereignty for the foreign power, and that was overriding of Indigenous rights. Okay. So then what comes from that is that colonial power then has the right to impose new forms of government, religion, language, and economic systems. All right, so this was taken in 1939, so which is just before the beginning, or just at the beginning of the Second World War. And it's useful to look at it at this time because after the Second World War, some of those colonial empires then were broken up. But it was certainly worthwhile for these countries to do their expansions because, you know, look at the massive increase that they had in population and in areas of their colonies. Okay, and of course the country which had the biggest colonial spread was Great Britain, and so there was a term at that time that the sun never set on the British Empire because of the global reach of their colonial empire. Okay. So we sometimes don't think about countries like Belgium or the Netherlands or Germany. You know, our Australian history tends to focus very much on English colonisation, you know, and then just a little bit on the French, you know, in terms of the race between England and France for places like Australia. Okay. So it's, you know, colonisation is something which affects the majority of the world. All right. So then if we look at, you know, what was the percentage of territories that were controlled, you know, 90% of Africa, 98.9% of Polynesia, 56.5% of Asia, 100% of Australia, and 27.2% of the Americas. And in that, that's predominantly the US and Canada, because in 1900, there had not been, you know, a wide movement into South America, apart from Spanish colonisation. Okay. So again, it just gives us some sense of the spread of colonisation. All right. So what happens with colonisation is that we get these processes of denial and withdrawal. So it's a denial that Indigenous peoples have sovereignty to their own lands, and it's a withdrawal of their abilities to speak as sovereign people, a withdrawal of their abilities to claim and have recognised land ownership. It's also a withdrawal often of rights of parenting. So colonial powers come in, and instead of children, you know, having, or the parents of children having the rights to parent their children, these colonial powers bring an idea, often, that Indigenous parenting is somehow deviant and that these children need saving. And in being saved, they will be removed from their families. We start to see things like destruction and eradication, so destruction of sacred sites, you know, and eradication of you know, ways of being different. So whether that's, you know, different styles of housing or agriculture or language, you know. And then you also get into the language these ideas about denigrating people and belittling them and insulting them. So simply to be an Indigenous person becomes something that's deemed as being negative. And then we start to move towards a kind of a surface acknowledgement and tokenism. So, you know, one of the terms that's used for this is imperialist nostalgia. So those countries which have colonised then become a little nostalgic and start to incorporate Indigenous people as part of their national narrative. You know, so using things like, you know, we can see around Australia how many local councils have an Aboriginal man with a spear as part of their council emblem. Okay. And then transformation and exploitation. So often Indigenous peoples become marginal workers. So it's a global theme that Indigenous people in the colonial process will be paid less for their labour. And, you know, so that the idea will be that they will transform to being colonial subjects, but always at the bottom of that economic hierarchy. All right, so this lecture, we're trying to think about what does it mean to decolonise. So sometimes people say, well, decolonisation can't happen because, you know, you can't just stop colonisation. Yeah, so put simply, it means overcoming or ameliorating the processes of colonisation. But what does that mean in practice? Okay, because we can't just withdraw this introduced sovereignty. So we need to think about how it can be enacted when introduced sovereignty remains. Okay, so working here on the concept of a Hawaiian, okay, so a Kanaka Maoli academic who says, well, we can have rediscovery and recovery. So in an Australian sense, that can mean revitalising Aboriginal languages, appreciating Aboriginal ecological knowledge, and recognition and inclusion of Aboriginal spirituality. So what might that mean in practice? Well, you probably have noticed in the news in the last couple of years that Australia has had some, you know, very terrible bushfires. Okay, and in part that's attributed to global warming. But what you'll also see is quite often in that footage, people saying, you know, we've been warning about this for a while because it hadn't been burned off. So one of the things that Indigenous knowledges tell us is that, you know, the country does need to be cleansed through burning. Okay, so this is referred to in a European sense as, you know, fire stick farming. The thing about fire stick farming and when it was done is that it's only done at certain times of the year, and in fact a fire that's done traditionally is what we call a cold burn. Okay, so it's very contained. It's often done when there's quite a lot of moisture still remaining in the bush, so that helps it being contained. A bushfire, on the other hand, which often happens, you know, in a sort of spring and summertime, is what we call a hot burn. And the difference between a cold burn and a hot burn in terms of carbon emissions is quite striking. All right, so what we're actually seeing now is local councils, but also multinational corporations that have large tracts of land, bringing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to perform traditional burns. And in fact, under government schemes, it can form part of their carbon credit or their carbon offset. So we know that just in the Northern Territory alone, since they reintroduced fire stick farming as a method, that there are hundreds of millions of tonnes carbon difference in what's happening with fire in the Northern Territory. Because in fact, in the Northern Territory, fire is one of the major reasons why carbon is released into the atmosphere. So we've got international, you know, multinational corporations that are using this knowledge. So, we're also starting to look, for instance, in Western New South Wales, at what it means to have healthy waterways. Because a lot of the knowledges that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have about healthy water, are the very things that have not been done since colonisation and put us in, contribute to the current situation that we're in. The other thing that we can see is that, when we talk about things like revitalising culture, there are now Aboriginal communities in Western New South Wales where, for the first time in their life, large tracts of those rivers are dry. And so, for us, while that's, clearly an issue for the rural community in general, it also has some really important cultural and spiritual ramifications for Aboriginal people. So at Wallatuka, we have a linkage with a group called POSH, which is an Indigenous health organisation that's run out of Sydney University. So part of what they're doing is they're going out to public schools in Western New South Wales and putting in water coolers, because for a lot of the kids out there, they can't just go to a bubbler and get water. So this is giving the kids clean, filtered water. And while it's benefiting Aboriginal children, it's also benefiting the non-Aboriginal children in the schools as well. So, in fact, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, make broader contributions to their community, and that's also often not acknowledged in the media. Okay. So the second concept that that's talked about for decolonisation is mourning. So it's the idea of acknowledging what has been lost, because if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are simply told, as we are, even by current politicians, you should just be grateful, or other things like, well, if the British hadn't come, somebody else would have, those kind of things. It doesn't allow for a recognition that there have been significant losses under colonisation, and that this in fact has caused hurt. So if this photo is taken from 1938, which was the sesquicentenary or 150th anniversary of the landing of the First Fleet, and so a group of Aboriginal people called a day of mourning. And you can't see because one of the young fellas standing there, but it says Aborigines only. And in 1938, that was a truly powerful statement to make. Okay, so from that, a petition was developed on the lack of rights for Aboriginal people to be given to the King, and a delegation of Aboriginal people from this conference went to Canberra, met with the Prime Minister and gave him the petition, but the Prime Minister said that he could not hand that petition on to the King because he could only get petitions from citizens, which is their entire point. Yeah. Okay. So dreaming. So not just a dreaming in the sense of acknowledging the dreaming, which is an Aboriginal, spiritual belief, but also the idea of imagining something else. And so I kind of like this quote here from Paul Keating, which says, "It seems to me that if we can imagine injustice, then we can imagine its opposite and we can have justice." So a decolonising framework is not just about saying, let's get all those statistics and show that Aboriginal people are disadvantaged. It says, we understand there is disadvantage. Let's have some action on how we can turn that disadvantage around, and let's start imagining what it looks like to have you know, an equal, socially just society. Okay. And in doing that, sometimes we need to let go of our ideas of what it means to be Aboriginal. So I've put a painting here, which is called Palm Valley, and it's by the late artist Albert Namatjira. And so Namatjira painted in this style, and you know, a lot of people said, oh, well, he's painting like a European man, that's not Aboriginal art. You know, does that mean that he's lost his culture? But when you look at a lot of his art, including this one, it's actually painting his country and sites of significance in his country. So Palm Valley is a site where he was a kuntungula or a manager, you know, under his linkage to land through his mother. So he had rights and responsibilities to that country. So it's a different format, but it's still an expression of himself and his identity as an Aboriginal person. So I think that sometimes, you know, people try to do things and someone else says to them, oh, you know, well, if you do that, you're not really Aboriginal. You know, we see Aboriginal girls who go to model and then someone will say, you know, and this is a pretty common one, oh, you're too pretty to be Aboriginal. And again, thinking about that language, what that's saying is Aboriginal people, you know, Aboriginal women are not pretty. And then if we look from last year, we see the American comedian Trevor Noah, who has a South African background, who said in his monologue, all women of the world are beautiful, except Aboriginal women in Australia. Yeah. And he then went on to make a crude reference that playing the didgeridoo would be similar to an Aboriginal woman's abilities and oral sex. This was from someone not even in our country. So how pervasive then are these ideas? Okay, so you may have seen, you know, quite a lot of media about that, or perhaps not. All right, so decolonisation then requires commitment. So things like the return of land, self-determination, you know, for some Aboriginal people, self-government, you know, for others, simply being enfranchised in general government. A lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people talk about having a national representative body. Okay, and then we need to think about how do these things happen and how do we have change. So this is probably one of the most famous Australian images of the 20th century, which is Gough Whitlam, when he was Prime Minister, returning the land to the Gurindji people, here with Vincent Lingiari. And when they had the 30th anniversary of that handback, Vincent Lingiari had passed, but his son, Victor Vincent Lingiari, you know, they said, oh, let's do a recreation of that photo, because Gough Whitlam was there. And instead of Gough pouring that sand into the hand of Victor Lingiari, Victor said, let's reverse that. And he poured the sand into Gough Whitlam's hands to symbolise, you know, that it's an ongoing process, you know, and that what had been created there was a relationship that would move backwards and forwards. Okay, so not simply this idea that things will be given back to Aboriginal people, but also the idea that Aboriginal people do give back to the broader community and have a value to to Australia in general. All right, so we need actions. So things like an inclusive education system, awareness, reconciliation, cultural competency. These are all part of what we see as being decolonising. Yeah, and certainly I know a lot of people that do first year sociology, you're doing things like social sciences and all of those kind of things. And, you know, these are seen as being really key areas where enacting these things can make a big difference. All right. So I might just start. So you probably will remember from earlier in the semester that there are a couple of what are considered the founding fathers of sociology, and one of them is Emile Durkheim, who is a French sociologist. And what we need to understand is that a lot of European intellectuals, the end of the 1700s and the 1800s, and even up into the beginning of the 1900s, stayed in Europe, but they got accounts coming from the colonies that were being published back in Europe. And, so it was a bit, I guess, like the soap opera of their day. People wanted to know about these strange and exotic beings in the rest of the world. And they also had what were called ethnographic circuses. So Indigenous peoples often kidnapped from their homelands and taken and displayed in Europe, so that people could get their entertainment from that, in much the same way as other circuses referred to as freak shows operated. Okay. So what happened was that these colonies were viewed as a data mine for material on the primitive. So there was this real push to prove that there was primitive man and modern man. And probably for us as sociologists, it's important to remember too that when they were talking about man, sometimes that referred to humanity in general, but often, the focus was actually simply on men. Okay, rather than women. Okay, so what happened was that white male intellectuals used this data for their own purposes. And for Emile Durkheim, he used this in a text called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Okay, so basically what he argued was that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' religious beliefs was the most primitive in the world. And so that you could then, see how humanity had developed. Okay. All right. So what's interesting is that even at the time, his work was roundly criticised by other intellectuals. It actually became one of the founding texts of the discipline of sociology. And in fact, even today, globally, the text is studied, and it's often studied without reference being made to the fact that it's, at best, ethnocentric, at worst, racist. Okay. And so let's look at an example. So this is about 30 years ago, so it's 1986. So it's just slightly before I came to university. And so, these are the sort of editions of Durkheim's work that were out when I did undergraduate sociology. So the American academic Jones says, but if Durkheim's goal was thus to understand modern man, why did he go to the very beginning of history? How can the crude cults of the Australian Aborigines tell us anything about religions far more advanced in value, dignity and truth? And if he insisted that they can, wasn't he suggesting that Christianity, for example, proceeds from the same primitive mentality as the Australian cults? Okay, so what you'll find is that texts with updated introductions like that are still in universities today. So if you get a student that's not exposed to, lectures like these or, the other things that you'll be doing during your degree, they're going to look at that and they're going to take that in as being truth. So Aboriginal people, primitive, cults, not advanced, don't have value, don't have dignity, don't have truth. So when we get these texts, even if they are historical, it's really important that we continue to try and challenge them. So we might have a break then till 5 past. Is that what you normally do? Yes. Okay. So we'll come back then. Okay, I'll wash my hands. Alrighty, we'll get going again. Okay. So, you may have been introduced to the Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell, and she wrote a text about Southern theory in which she talked about Durkheim's writing. Yeah, and I think you know, that it's a bit problematic. So she said for Durkheim that Australian totemism fitted the bill because Australian Aborigines had the most primitive documented society. Here, the crude racism of a Ward or Sumner is transcended up to a point. Durkheim's prejudice takes a very sophisticated form, but his sociology embeds a deeply ethnocentric viewpoint nonetheless. And I think, you know, for me, this is what we see a lot of the time. You know, someone makes a racist comment, you know, or has a racist perspective, and people will say, oh, I think that was just a badly chosen word, or, you know, but they're very intelligent. You know, so it says here, his prejudice takes a very sophisticated form. Is there a sophisticated form of prejudice? Yeah. I don't know. So there's that sense in which I think that sometimes when we have these things, you know, these canons of our discipline, that instead of going hard, you know, go hard or go home, well, for me, this is going home. You know, it doesn't take it far enough.
But then what's the flow-on effect? Because if a discipline like sociology says, oh, we'd like to have more Aboriginal people come into it, which they do, but then you've got, Australia's top sociologist, that would be where you'd start reading, right? So people are going to read this and go, oh, that's a bit yuck. Yeah, no, I don't think I'll go there. So what we really need to be careful, I think, in our decolonising is to kind of think about what are the effects of our critique. It's not going to hurt Durkheim. He's long gone. But it's still creating this environment where we say, if I can write well, then it's okay for me to be prejudiced. And I don't think it is, whether it's about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But we also see similar arguments about, people who, would, make their comments about, say, transgendered people. So we see incredibly smart people who, will be very clumsy. It's just a clumsy way of referring to a transgendered person. So it's a whole range of discourses that are really important in the here and now that we need to address and think about how do we do this in a different way, because it's not good enough. And I think sociology is really good at calling out things like gender, but they need to move that further into other areas. Okay, so, all right. So Darwin sort of further says, that, people like Charles Darwin, So we hear about Darwin when we go to school, and then sometimes when we come to sociology, we hear about social Darwinism. We don't often get the story that Darwin, in fact, came to Australia and asked to see Aboriginal people. And some of the comments that he made were incredibly damaging. Okay, so Connell here quoting Darwin's description of Aboriginal ceremonial dances, all moving in hideous harmony. They formed a perfect display of a festival amongst the lowest barbarians. And then Connell says, despite the pejoratives, Darwin was not hostile to the Australian Aboriginal groups he met. He admired their bushcraft and hunting skills, sympathised with their vulnerability to imported disease, and did not blame them for the frontier violence, which was very kind. But he did regard the Australian Aborigines as a more primitive people than the British. He expected their extinction, and he saw this as an unavoidable consequence of a stronger variety of man meeting a weaker. So wherever the European has trod, death seems to pursue the Aboriginal, which is what Darwin said. Okay? So for Darwin, though, this was somehow the result of something that was natural. As sociologists, what we can see is that it was a result of something structural. Okay? The imposition of new forms of government, which came with arms. So, again, this is a kind of softly critique. All right. So one of the terms that we do, that's found its way into sociology from the work of Spivak is this idea of epistemic violence, which is the violence of knowledge, and the violence of how we talk about people. All right. So in Spivak's sense then, Darwin's works, we could say, are epistemically violent because of the terms that he uses: savage, hideous, primitive, hostile, miserable, filthy, and wretched. So wherever in the world he's talking about Indigenous peoples, these are the words that he was using. So when he came to Australia, Darwin compared the self-reflective capacities of Aboriginal women to his dog. And he said, how little can the hard-worked wife of a degraded Australian savage, who uses very few abstract words and cannot count above 4, exert her self-consciousness or reflect on the nature of her very existence? Okay, so he actually thought that his dog had a higher capacity for thought than Aboriginal women. And you think, oh, okay, so that's what he's saying, but does that really affect anything? Well, yeah, it does. So in the 1800s, there was this science called phrenology, which is the study of the bumps on your head. And the bumps on your head can tell us whether you're going to be criminal, whether you're going to be promiscuous, how intelligent you're going to be. Okay, so I know that we're after the break, energy is low, so participant thing here. Run your hand down the back of your head, and when you get to about here, okay, see if there's a bump, okay? So just where you start to go from your head to the neck. Okay, how many people have a bump? Anyone doesn't have a bump? Anyone doesn't have a bump? Okay, oh, disappointing, small number of people. Okay, all right, so if you have a bump, as everyone does, and I do as well, congratulations. According to phrenologists, you have philoprogenitiveness, which is the ability to love pets and children. And in fact, most people have a bump there. Yeah. Funnily enough, I've done this in the big lecture theatre at Callaghan, and the one person who didn't have a bump there, when I said that, she said, oh yeah, well actually I don't love pets or children. Which was, you know, I had to say, well yeah, it's only one person, so it's not scientifically relevant, but it was unfortunate. Okay. So you think, all right, so this is what the science is saying. So a group of, welfare, what we now term welfare workers and anthropologists were getting together to look at policies on Aboriginal women, and they thought, let's look at the skulls of Aboriginal women and determine whether or not they have this bump, and unsurprisingly, most of them did. Now, this posed a problem for this group because they realised that if Aboriginal women have the ability to love pets and children, and you took away their children, it will cause them pain. So you think, oh, okay, ouch. How are they going to get around that one? So the way that they got around that is that they said while Aboriginal women had the ability to love pets and children, they lacked the capacity to distinguish between the two. So if you took away an Aboriginal woman's child, but she had a dog, she'd be fine. And we kind of look at that now and go, this is just it's ridiculous. But it informed that early policy. And then when you come into the 20th century, people are not going back and reading, why did we have this policy? But you still have this mindset that somehow you can remove Aboriginal children and you're not going to just absolutely decimate their mother, their father, the community that you're taking them from. So it plays itself out in some really, strong ways. And then the other thing that I think we need to be aware of is to be a little bit cautious about science, because I know like a lot of us come from a social science background, and can tend to be that sense that, if we, we're social scientists and there's the natural sciences and they're called the hard sciences and they're about truth and they're about rationality. But in fact, science changes over time. Science is about belief. Yes, there's testing against that belief, but a lot of the testing or the conclusions, as in that case, are based on basically what people want to find rather than necessarily on this blank slate this is what we did find. So another example, about gender rather than race is that it was thought in the early 1900s by some scientists that women should be excluded from universities because the more that a woman read, the smaller her ovaries would shrink and it would lead to infertility. And they based this on the fact that educated women were more likely to have less children. So, there's your kind of fact, but there's your very strange interpretation. So I can tell you, I've been an academic for a long while. I probably read more than people did in the early 1900s. I have 3 children. So if you're thinking about using that as a contraceptive method, don't do, would not recommend. Okay, so, but that belief was held by people who had the power to keep women out of universities, to keep women from voting. Women can't vote because they're irrational, So these ideas that we see in the past, become embedded in some really strange ways in our structures. And if we don't go back and fully unpick what it is that we're talking about, people say, why would, say, the footballer Adam Goodes be so upset about being called an ape? It's just being called someone. Well, it comes back to Darwin, because it's Darwin that's writing saying that there's apes, and then in the hierarchy of mankind, that the next group is Aboriginal people. That's where that comes from. So it actually, is much deeper than just an ordinary slight. All right. So we know then that we get these policies that disempower Aboriginal people, and because of those mindsets in the past, they always present Aboriginal people as being somehow incapable of managing their own lives. Okay, and it's particularly true in the policy that we get. So people avoid looking at what are the lived experiences of Aboriginal people today in favour of comfortable stereotyping. So they're still using phrases such as for their own good and in their best interests. You might remember the debate on morning television this year where people were saying, we need a new stolen generation. Now that's ill-informed, but what happens for Aboriginal people looking at that is, especially I think for older people who lived through the earlier iteration of the stolen generation, that's horrifying. It's horrifying not just that it can be said, but that then it was over and over defended. Okay, so we get this idea for their own good in their best interests. We get this idea of the intervention. And we also get this idea that people say, I have the best of intentions. But good intentions are not enough. All right. So we need to understand, from our sociological perspective, a couple of different key terms. So the first one is the state. So sometimes that refers to colonial authority, to state and territory governments, more often in legislation to the federal government, but it can also refer to authorities such as police or welfare officers or boards such as the Aborigines Protection Board. Okay. And we know, for instance, that academics played a role in things like the Aborigines Protection Board. The anthropologist A.P. Elkin from Sydney University was the head of the Aborigines Protection Board in New South Wales. So the relationship between universities and the state and control of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is pretty murky when we look at this kind of history. All right. So policy can refer to a range of initiatives that are implemented to govern Aboriginal peoples. So it might be legislation, it might be laws, might be specifically named policy documents. But a lot of the time it's rules that influence action, which may not be based in fact. So for example, some Aboriginal people were eligible to vote before the 1967 referendum, but believed that they were legally ineligible. And also in the community in which they lived, and it's that community that would run voting, it was believed they were ineligible. So you sometimes get changes in policy or policy that doesn't apply, but people believe that it does. So this is again why you actually need to very positively overturn what's kind of going on. Was that me?
Siri.
Oh, Siri. Oh, okay. Right. No. So I was like, oh. All right. Sorry again, people online. It's just, it's glitching. It's me. All right. So we'd get this kind of art. So art's, a really important representation. So this idea of Aboriginal people. So here it's called Australian Aborigines as they appeared at the time when wild in the woods, the noble savage ran. Okay, so this idea that living in this pre-colonial society, even though savage, still had some sense of nobility. And then Australian Aborigines as they appear after a course of civilising association with European races. So in some sense, there's a little bit of an irony there to say that perhaps colonisation has not been for the best. But it still doesn't, accurately, I think, reflect in either case what was going on. But that's probably the subject of a much longer lecture. Okay. And then we get paintings like this kind of assimilationist dream where this could be a painting taken in Europe with all the weeping willows. It just so happens that in this Aboriginal people are in the colonial dress, but much that it would be quite assimilated. So this idea was predominating as well. But then, let's look at Governor Davies' proclamation to the Aborigines in 1816. Okay. So, I suppose the first thing to say about this is that Governor Davies was clearly thinking about how to make this proclamation. So, he's had it done in pictures, okay, so rather than text. And that would have been not just for Aboriginal people, but also for the colonists as well, given that literacy rates for them were fairly low. Okay, so in that top tile, we've got an Aboriginal man and a non-Aboriginal man, Aboriginal child, non-Aboriginal child, and so on. But what we see there is that all of the Aboriginal people in this picture have adopted European dress. So it's very much about, what in that time, that early 1800s, was this need to civilise. So to make Indigenous peoples like Europeans. And we look in the second tile where we've got this idea of governance. So we've got the governor there with two soldiers and a free gentleman meeting with a delegation of Aboriginal people. What we can see is that they've tried to give an idea of some kind of chieftain there. So the cloak and the headdress on the Aboriginal man shaking hands. That wouldn't have been what the society was like, because there wasn't that kind of structure. There's certainly a structure of eldership, certainly a hierarchy of knowledges, but not like that. One of the things that I find really interesting is that they put a child in the Aboriginal delegation. And if you think about European and European Australian society at that time, there was the term that children should be seen but not heard. So children would not have been part of a public delegation. The fact that the artist has put that there means that I'm assuming that they had probably seen children, moving with Aboriginal adults. And one of the things that as a sociologist, that I can infer from that, because I see it even today, is the centrality of children to Aboriginal communities and the fact that children are not excluded from public life. So I've also taught a course called Working with Aboriginal People. And one of the things that I'll say is that, you might have a hall full of people and the minister might be there to speak and kids will be there and they'll be running up and down and all of that kind of thing. And quite often people who come in from the outside say, well, why are the kids there? Why aren't they being told to be quiet? But because children are such an integral part of Aboriginal life, it's quite normal to have the kids moving around while people have a conversation. It's quite normal that if a child falls over and they're crying, it doesn't matter if it's the Prime Minister up there talking, people are going to focus on that child. So ideas about public life are not universal. Even just that idea of the people up the front and the audience is quite different to Aboriginal ideas of meetings, which are often more about having a circle and talking. So it's that bureaucratic style where you've got, your office bearers up the front and everybody else, can sit and listen, or they can propose ideas to the office bearers, but very different ideas about power in public life. And then in the third and the fourth tile, what we see here is, in the first one, can't quite see the spear, but it reads as, if an Aboriginal man spears a colonist and the colonist dies, the man will hang. Down here, if a colonist shoots an Aboriginal man and the Aboriginal man dies, the colonist will hang. The problem with this is that for that community and in many other Aboriginal communities, the correct punishment for killing someone would be a ritual spearing. So that wouldn't make sense for people who were seeing that. And in fact, given that that's a completely different art style to Aboriginal art, I'm not even sure that the entire document would make sense, even though it's in pictures. Okay, so for instance, we see examples where they'll say that, that a shepherd was speared by Aboriginal men, and quite often related to that is a story about how that particular shepherd had sexually assaulted Aboriginal women. So for those people, the correct response under law was a spearing. But, so there's these two different systems of law without, each side understanding the other side's form of law. The other thing that we can see is that in Aboriginal cultures, there is no evidence at all that hanging was used as a method of punishment or as a method of self-harm. So this is something that's been introduced. And I think then sociologically, that tells us something very interesting, because through Aboriginal deaths in custody and high Aboriginal suicide rates, when we look at a lot of contemporary Aboriginal art, it does feature, the noose as, something that really gravely affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But that is something that was introduced in the colonial period. So when I look at this, I think, this actually was a really amazing attempt to try and communicate. But like so much of well-intentioned policy, I don't think that it would have been successful. Okay, so in 1937, a policy of assimilation was promoted, that the destiny of the natives of Aboriginal origin, but not the full blood, lies in their ultimate absorption by the people of the Commonwealth, and all effort should be directed to that end. So, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people talk about assimilation negatively and are then often criticised in turn, or, you know, where's your evidence? That's the view from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So what we can do in sociology is we can say, okay, let's look at what the actual people who instigated assimilation said. Okay, so A.O. Neville, the Chief Protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, said at the Native Welfare Conference, "We have power under the Act to take any child from its mother at any stage of its life. Are we going to have a population of 1 million blacks in the Commonwealth, or are we going to merge them into our white community and eventually forget that there were ever any Aborigines in Australia?" All right, so we can... Okay, Dr. Cecil Cook, who was the Chief Protector in the Northern Territory, said at the same time, "Generally by the 5th and invariably by the 6th generation, all native characteristics of the Australian Aborigine are eradicated. The problem of our half-castes will quickly be eliminated by the complete disappearance of the black race and the swift submergence of their progeny in the white." So when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people say that assimilation was meant to destroy us as a people, to have our people disappear, and we get critiqued for that, it's a bit hard to argue with when the people who implemented the policy said that was what they were aiming to do. So again, you know, it's about who has the power to speak. Oh yeah, Aboriginal people are just saying that. No, we're not just saying it. That's actually what it aimed to do. You know, so if Aboriginal people say that the policy of the stolen generations was genocidal, people say, oh, you know, no, you know, we've seen genocide. It's not genocidal. But under the United Nations definition of genocide, if you transfer the children from one racial or ethnic group to another racial or ethnic group with the goal of eliminating the culture of that first group, that is genocide. And when we look at the writings of, you know, of these people, that is what they were aiming to do. Let's take those children so that we can have the complete disappearance of the black race. That is genocide. It's you know, it's not me playing word games. That the complete disappearance. That's what it is. All right, so yes, allow. Okay, so this was it was dramatised in the film Rabbit Proof Fence, but video unavailable, of course it is. Dramatised in the film Rabbit Proof Fence, but what they did was they went on A.O. Neville, the Chief Protector's, you know, actual notes, and they had a slide which he would show. So he, you know, he'd put this slide up, and then he has his little pointer and he says, you know, this is the answer. So he'll say half-caste mother, quarter-caste daughter, and then octoroon grandson. And he says, you know, by that third generation or the third cross, the native has simply been bred out. You know? So what we see with this is we actually have enough evidence that doesn't have to come from our oral histories. It actually comes from the written records of the agents of the state, okay, to say this is what they were aiming to do. All right, so Aboriginal historian Jackie Huggins argues, we Aboriginal people are all products of the stolen generations, whether we were taken directly from our parents or not. Okay, so we've had people when the Royal Commission into the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, when that was undertaken, the then Prime Minister of Australia, Tim Fischer, said, well, it wasn't a useful term because, as far as he could see, at most, only 4 out of 10 Aboriginal children were taken. So that doesn't constitute a whole generation. But I think, if you just think about 10 people, that you care about, family or friends, and then you arbitrarily take 4 of them away, that would make an enormous difference to your life. The flow-on effects of that would be enormous. So I think when we get those kind of comments, oh, it's only 4 out of 10, 40% of children, to me that's quite mean-spirited. Okay, so the argument was it was in the best interests of the child. But we know that Aboriginal people who were removed from their families are less likely to have undertaken a post-secondary education, much less likely to have stable living conditions and more likely to be geographically mobile, 3 times more likely to say they had no one to call on in a crisis, less likely to be in a stable, confiding relationship with a partner, 3 times as likely to report having been in jail, less likely to have a strong sense of their Aboriginal cultural identity, more likely to have discovered their Aboriginality later in life, and less likely to know about their Aboriginal cultural traditions. So it's only in that last sense, this last criteria, that the removal of Aboriginal children achieved its purpose. Because all of those other things, that was supposed to lead to improvement, but the policy aimed for the children to not have a sense of Aboriginal cultural identity, and that is what it has achieved. What we see today in the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children is rates that are sometimes higher than they were under the period of the stolen generations. Okay, but the Bringing Them Home report, which is the sort of colloquial way of referring to the report from the Royal Commission, acknowledged in its introduction that the past is very much with us today in the continuing devastation of the lives of Indigenous Australians. That devastation cannot be addressed unless the whole community listens with an open heart and mind to the stories of what has happened in the past, and having listened and understood, commits itself to reconciliation. So I think one of the things that, that we sometimes see that happens in Australia is we get into this very strange circular logic where someone says, well, non-Aboriginal children were removed as well, and they also had, incredible, trauma and hardship. And I think that's absolutely true. But I don't think one cancels out the other. In fact, what I think we can do is see that actually formed quite a coherent situation for the state, because a lot of the time the state was punishing non-Aboriginal people for not being compliant with what the state wanted. So if you were poor, it was your fault you were poor. If you're a woman having a child out of wedlock, it was your fault. So I don't see the two of them as being exclusive. I actually see them as forming quite a coherent part of, what was happening in Australia at the time. So I think that actually should give more empathy to the situations of the stolen generations and not less. Okay, so we had Kevin Rudd give the apology from the Parliament to the stolen generations, and so that's still acknowledged each year. But for some people, as they're saying, well, if we're actually removing children at a higher rate, what have we actually learned by that? So in New South Wales, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children make up 25% of all children in care and the protection system, despite comprising less than 2% of the total population of children. And in Victoria, Indigenous children comprise 10% of children in care and less than 1% of the population in the 0 to 17 age range. So what we haven't managed to do is to fully address the effects of the ongoing effects of colonisation, and we still have these mentalities about what is in the best interests. We have made I think some small improvements. So putting in things like kinship care. So if a child does need to be removed, can they remain within their family circle or their community circle? But there's still a long way to go, and I know that many of the people that do SOCA1010 intend in the future to work in some kind of role, particularly if they're doing the social sciences, to work in some kind of role where they have the opportunity to really make a difference here. All right. But then we see Aboriginal communities that face eviction from their homelands. So one of the things which Tony Abbott said when he was Prime Minister was that Aboriginal people living on homelands was a lifestyle choice. And there were people that said no, whether or not you have avocado on your toast is a lifestyle choice. Living on your country with your families is not a lifestyle choice. One of the things that we can see is that those people, who were evicted from their homelands, were then moved to urban areas where they didn't have connections, where, they did so, often having had the homes that they lived in bulldozed, so they had lost possessions, no savings. That means that for those communities, starting again, split up, means that they're starting, behind the post again in that opportunity to really exceed. So Noel Pearson has said, the optimum position for non-Indigenous people to take is that of acknowledgement of the past and its legacy in the present, recognising that racism is not a contrivance, that Indigenous people endured great hurt and confront barriers as a result of racism. They need to take responsibility for the fact of racism and work to answer and counter it. Okay, Jackie Huggins, who was one of the former chairs of Reconciliation Australia, said, change is fine as long as it makes sense and it isn't change for the sake of it, or even worse, change for purely political reasons that bear little relevance to the daily lives of my people. Okay, so Aboriginal people absolutely recognising that there is some change needed, but how do we do that? So Professor Mick Dodson says, I don't care how hard it is, you build Aboriginality or you get nothing. There's no choice about it. If our Aboriginal people cannot change how it is among themselves, then the Aboriginal people will never climb back out of hell. So this sense then of empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, in what we call self-determination. So the ability to determine at that grassroots level what are the changes that are needed. So we see, for instance, an example where there were grants from the government and a community from the Mid-North Coast said, we're going to apply for a grant, we want fishing boats. If we can have fishing boats, you know, we know how to fish. We can have fishing boats, we'll have economic self-sufficiency, we'll have jobs for our young people. And the government came back and said, well, I don't think you need fishing boats, what you need is housing. So they built houses. Unfortunately then, people still didn't have jobs, so they couldn't maintain the rents of the houses. You know, so there's this sense in which a lot of the time Aboriginal communities say, this is what we want, this is what we need to be self-determining, and governments come in and say, no, I don't think so. Here's what you need. But they're not addressing those underlying structural aspects. You know, and in doing so, it keeps, you know, many Aboriginal people being reliant on the state. Okay. The late Bob Randall said, you threw me a line called welfare, but it's not as good as what I had. The chaos and sadness we are feeling now is a result of our history. Open truth will set us free, not hidden truth. Okay, so we see that, you know, with reconciliation, it's very much about, you know, what's called truth telling. I might not watch that because I'll just go to the final few slides. You can go on and watch that song if you'd like to. All right. So one of the things that we find in the social sciences is that you often get asked to analyse a policy. If you're going to look at a policy, you should try and read the policy yourself rather than relying completely on other people's interpretations of the document. So look at the construction of language in the document, and that can be useful in understanding the persona of the times. So if we look at the Aborigines Protection Act of 1909, when they're talking about the difference between Aboriginal people that were deemed as full bloods and people who were seen in that caste system as half caste, quarter caste or octoroons, it was referred to in the policy as having an admixture of the superior blood. Okay, so again, it's very clear that non-Aboriginal people were seen as superior to Aboriginal people. It's there in black and white. No pun intended. Okay, so think about who the policy is written for. Is it phrased in a way that's accessible to a community audience? Yeah, or is it written to exclude certain groups and empower others like bureaucrats and lawyers? Because if you've ever read something like the Native Title Act, you know, it's not there to be read by Aboriginal communities, it's there to be read by lawyers. You know, so when was the Act repealed? Sometimes we find that policy is no longer used in practice, but remains as a legal option to be enforced. And then think about what policy replaced it. So what changes were made, because a lot of the time that then helps you see what was the problem with the first policy, if you look at the second policy to see what change there was. Okay. Looking at policy evaluation reports can be useful. So government reports, inquiries, royal commissions. So I've got a link there to the Aboriginal deaths in custody, to the bringing them home report of the National Inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, and then the 10th anniversary edition of that. A really great site to go is the Human Rights Commission, which was formerly called the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission. They have reports, they have media releases, fact sheets, legislation, the most up-to-date statistics that are actually readable. You can get statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but a lot of the time it's a little bit difficult to kind of get. But Australian Human Rights, you know, will often have done the job of drawing that information out for you. Okay, and also some events that you can attend. One of the positions that they have is called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, and that's held by an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, and every year they bring out a social justice report and also a native title report. So very good, academically rigorous, well referenced. And this just sometimes, if you're doing an assignment and it's on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, these are the kind of sources that your marker is going to look at and go, yeah, this person's gone in depth, rather than just getting the chapter on Aboriginal people out of your general sociology textbook. That's a good place to start, absolutely. Another really good place is the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at ANU. So they've got, I think it's more now, but a couple of hundred discussion papers, and they're available for free download. They've also got e-books that you can get. So there's no reason why you necessarily have to come on campus or be reliant on the library to be able to find some really good resources. And then you can also go to different groups like ANTAR, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, Close the Gap, Reconciliation Australia, and Women for WIC. And these are all really good sites that I would recommend. And then finally, this is just something that you might like to think of for yourself, because I guarantee you that if you're going for a job in Australia that requires something like a Bachelor of Social Science, but many other degrees as well, you will either as an essential or a desirable criteria be asked to consider either how you would work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients or communities, or how you would work with people, from a non-English speaking background, so a cultural thing. I've sat on lots and lots of interview committees, and quite often you have people that are sort of neck and neck on all of those main criterias. And when they come to this criteria, a lot of the time people have very short, very kind of generic answers. If you're looking at your job, and you might have to consider this in some of your compulsory SOCSI courses, you're looking at a job and the criteria is there for working with Aboriginal communities, please make sure that you really do your homework on being able to answer that one, because I've seen people win and lose a job when when it's really tight. They'll be solid, 8, 9 out of 10 on every criteria, and then they come to that one and they go, yes, well, I'm supportive of reconciliation and I understand, and it just becomes, you haven't actually done your homework on that one. And so it can make a difference. So there's just a little self-audit based on some work done by some academics in Victoria. And just think about, are you aware of your own cultural heritage? Are you aware of the concept of culture? Because we sometimes get students who say, well, I don't really have a culture. Yeah, you do. It's just that your culture is all around you, so you don't think about it as being culture. But everyone has a culture. Are you aware of your own worldviews and biases? Because we all have them. Just looking through, are you confident about establishing trust when communicating with Indigenous peoples? So this is something that I could say is important to you from a social justice point of view, but it's also critical to you in terms of your employability. So it's, I would love it if everyone just saw it as important, but at the end of the day, it's also about your own employment prospects. So it's really critical for you to get this done and get it done right. Because if you can do that, then you can be an agent of change. And, that's what we would hope for you. Okay, so That's it. Have a good tutorial. Thank you. Yeah, that would be awesome. It's just Kathleen.Butler. Oh, God, yeah. It's pretty scary. That would be fabulous.
Yeah. Together.
Oh, okay.
Mother and daughter.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, how funny.
No. When I graduated with my PhD, my mum graduated with her master's.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's same